Sometimes a man's last dollar becomes his first step towards something much bigger, true redemption. When everything you've worked hard to build crumbles to dust, it's what you do with what's left that truly matters. Elias was down to his final $90 when he bought that abandoned church in a forgotten ghost town, planning to tear it down for lumber just to survive another month. What he found behind the rotting altar changed everything. Stacks of gold bars and a leather-bound journal revealing the town preacher was actually a notorious outlaw who'd hidden his fortune in God's house. But here's the question. What other secrets did that journal hold about treasures still waiting to be found across the territory? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The wind carried dust across the empty streets of Redemption Flats, a town that had died 30 years before but refused to lie down proper. Elias Thorne stood at the edge of what used to be Main Street, his weathered hands gripping the reins of his mare, Sadie, while his eyes traced the skeletal remains of storefronts and homes that once housed families, dreams, and ordinary lives. At 62 years old, he'd seen enough ghost towns to know they all had the same hollow feel, like abandoned shells on a beach. Whatever made them alive had long since moved on. His fingers found the pocket watch in his vest, a habit formed over 4 decades. The gold case was worn smooth where his thumb had rubbed it countless times, and when he pressed the release, it opened with a soft click that seemed too delicate for the harsh landscape around him. 3:47 in the afternoon. His father had carried this watch for 50 years before passing it to Elias on his deathbed, and his grandfather had carried it for 40 years before that. Time's the only thing that treats every man the same, his father had told him. Rich or poor, good or bad, we all get the same 24 hours. What matters is what we do with them. Elias closed the watch and returned it to his pocket. His father had been a ranch foreman, a man who understood cattle and horses and hard work. He'd built a modest life through honest labor, never asking for more than he'd earned. Elias had tried to follow that path. For 38 years, he'd worked ranches across Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona, breaking horses, mending fences, moving cattle, doing whatever needed doing. He'd been good at his work, reliable and steady, the kind of man ranch owners valued and kept on through lean seasons. But steady work doesn't guarantee a steady future. 3 years ago, the Blackwood Ranch, where he'd worked for the last 12 years, had been sold to a corporate outfit from back east. They'd brought in their own men, younger fellows who worked for less and didn't ask questions about cutting corners on feed or veterinary care. Elias had found himself unemployed at 59, with arthritic knees, a bad shoulder from a horse kick 20 years back, and $300 in savings. He'd picked up work where he could after that, day labor, temporary positions, anything to keep food in his belly and grain for Sadie. But the truth was plain as the sun overhead. The world had less use for men like him with each passing year. The big ranches wanted young bucks who could work 16-hour days without complaint. The small operations were disappearing, bought up or foreclosed on. The romantic notion of the working cowboy was fading into history, replaced by mechanical efficiency and bottom-line thinking. 6 months ago, he'd been down to his last $140 when he'd met Ben Calhoun in a diner outside Tucson. Ben had been a friend from his younger days, back when they'd both worked the Miller spread in West Texas. They'd shared stories over coffee, the way old friends do, carefully avoiding the obvious questions about how they'd ended up in a roadside diner at their age, eating the cheapest items on the menu. Ben had mentioned Redemption Flats almost in passing. Place died when the silver ran out back in '93, he'd said, stirring sugar into his 3rd refill. Not a soul left there now except maybe some rattlesnakes and memories. County's been trying to sell off the remaining buildings for years, just to get them off the tax rolls. Can't give most of them away. Something about that had stuck with Elias. He'd ask questions. How far? What condition? Who'd contact? Ben had given him the information without asking why a broke cowboy would care about buildings in a ghost town. Maybe he'd understood, or maybe he'd just been too polite to pry. The county assessor's office had a list of properties available in redemption flats, each one described in bureaucratic language that couldn't quite hide their worthlessness. Houses with collapsed roofs, a general store with 3 standing walls, a livery stable that was more kindling than structure. And at the bottom of the list, one church, built 1887, wood frame construction, significant deterioration, sold as is, minimum bid $90. $90 for a church. The irony wasn't lost on Elias. He'd never been a particularly religious man, though he'd sat through enough Sunday services over the years to be familiar with the ritual and rhythms. His mother had been devout, insisting her children attend church every week, and he'd absorbed her teachings about kindness, honesty, and doing right by your fellow man. But he'd seen too much hardship and unfairness to believe in a benevolent overseer keeping score. If there was a God, Elias figured he was probably too busy with bigger concerns to worry about one aging cowboy's troubles. Still, there was something about that church that called to him. Maybe it was the craftsmanship. Buildings from that era were built to last, constructed by men who took pride in their work. The wood alone might be worth something if it was sound. Cypress or redwood, perhaps. Materials that could weather decades and still hold value. Even if the structure was too far gone, he might salvage enough lumber to sell for a few $100s. It wasn't a fortune, but it was a strategy, and that was more than he'd had in months. He'd sent in his bid with $48 left to his name. 2 weeks later, a letter had arrived at the general delivery address he'd been using. The church was his. He'd needed to send payment within 10 days or forfeit the bid. The timing had been close. He'd found 3 days of work helping a farmer repair storm damage, enough to keep him fed while he figured out his next move. Now here he stood, the proud owner of an abandoned church in a dead town, with precisely $7 and change in his pocket. Sadie shifted beside him, patient as always, and he ran a hand along her neck. She'd been with him for 9 years, a good mare with a steady temperament and more sense than most people he'd known. He'd have to figure out what to do with her if this lumber salvage plan didn't work out. The thought sat heavy in his chest. The church stood at the far end of what had been Main Street, its white paint long since stripped away by wind and weather. The steeple still stood, though it leaned slightly to the east, and the front steps had partially collapsed on one side. Windows that once held stained glass were now empty frames, dark openings that gave the building a hollow-eyed appearance. But the main structure looked intact from here. Walls still vertical, roof mostly in place, the bones of the building holding together against the odd. Elias tied Sadie to what remained of a hitching post and approached the church on foot. His boots crunched on sand and scattered debris. The door hung crooked on its hinges, swollen from moisture and warped from heat, but it opened with a long groan when he put his shoulder to it. Inside, the air was cooler and carried the musty smell of old wood and abandonment. Dust motes danced in the shafts of light that came through the broken windows. Pews still lined the central aisle, though many had been damaged by water leaks or visiting animals. The floorboards creaked under his weight, but they held. At the far end, the altar stood on a raised platform, a simple wooden structure that would have held the preacher's Bible and perhaps a cross or candlesticks. Elias walked the length of the church slowly, testing boards, examining joints, gauging the quality of the construction. The craftsmanship was evident even in the building's decay. Whoever had built this church had known their trade. The wood was indeed cypress, a material that resisted rot and held up well to the elements. If he could carefully dismantle the structure, he might get more than he'd hoped from the lumber. He climbed the 3 steps to the altar platform and ran, his hands over the smooth wood. The altar itself was beautifully made, with dovetailed joints and careful finishing work. It seemed a shame to tear it apart, but sentiment didn't pay for meals. He'd need to start here, he decided, removing the altar first to access the structural beams behind it. The sun was getting lower, painting long shadows across the church interior. Elias had planned to camp nearby tonight and start work in the morning when he had good light. He'd brought basic tools, hammer, pry bar, saw, and supplies for a few days. If the work went well, he might be able to dismantle enough of the church in a week to haul the lumber to the nearest town and find a buyer. He returned to Sadie and gathered his bedroll and saddlebags. There was a clearing behind the church where he could build a small fire without worrying about sparking dry grass. As he walked around the building, he noticed details he'd missed before. A small cemetery plot to the north, headstones weathered to near illegibility, and what looked like the remains of a parsonage, little more than a foundation and a few charred timbers. The evening passed quietly. He made coffee over his fire and ate jerky and hardtack, the kind of simple meal he'd consumed 10,000 times in his life. The stars came out thick and bright, unpolluted by any nearby lights, and he sat wrapped in his bedroll, watching them wheel slowly overhead. His father's watch ticked steadily in his vest, measuring out the hours with mechanical precision. Tomorrow he'd begin dismantling his church, taking apart what others had built with hope and faith in a better future. There was a melancholy to that thought, but Elias had learned long ago that nostalgia didn't fill an empty stomach. The past was gone, the present was what it was, and the future depended on making practical decisions with what little you had left. He finished his coffee, banked at the fire, and settled into his bedroll under the stars. Sleep came easily, as it usually did after a long day's ride. His last thought before drifting off was about where he might find a buyer for cypress lumber. There was a builder in Socorro who might be interested, or perhaps that furniture maker in Silver City who'd mentioned looking for quality wood. Tomorrow, he'd find out if his gamble on this abandoned church would pay off, or if he'd just spent his last $90 on one more disappointment in a life that had recently specialized in them. Either way, he'd face it the same way he'd faced everything else, 1 hour at a time, doing the work that needed doing and hoping it would somehow be enough. Morning came with the kind of clear, dry heat that promised a scorching afternoon. Elias was up before dawn, his internal clock still set to ranch, hours after decades of early risings. He made coffee, ate a cold breakfast, and gathered his tools as the sun painted the eastern sky in shades of orange and pink. By the time full daylight reached Redemption Flats, he was already inside the church, studying the altar with a carpenter's eye. The structure was more complex than it had first appeared. The altar wasn't simply a table or platform, but a carefully constructed piece with a main surface supported by an ornate framework. The front panel displayed carved crosses and geometric patterns, work that would have taken considerable skill and time. Whoever built this had invested themselves in creating something meant to inspire reverence and permanence. Elias began at the joints, looking for the easiest way to disassemble the piece without damaging the wood. He'd learned long ago that patience in the beginning saved effort and waste later on. The morning passed with the slow, methodical work of loosening ancient nails and gently prying boards apart. The wood was sound, better than he'd hoped. Each piece he removed revealed more of the altar's construction, hidden bracing, careful joinery, the marks of hand tools from an era when such work was done with patience and pride. Around mid-morning, he'd removed the top surface and the decorative front panel, exposing the altar's internal framework. That's when he noticed something odd. The floor of the altar, the base where the preacher would have stood, wasn't solid. There was a seam he'd mistaken for a natural crack in the wood, but on closer inspection, it was too straight, too deliberate. He ran his fingers along it, feeling the slight depression where two pieces met. His heart quickened slightly. Hidden compartments weren't unheard of in old furniture, though he'd never encountered one personally. Sometimes people built in small spaces for keeping valuables or important documents away from casual view. He worked his pry bar carefully along the seam, applying gentle pressure, testing for give. Something shifted. A section of the flooring, roughly 2 feet square, lifted slightly. It wasn't nailed down, it was designed to be removed. Elias set aside his pry bar and used his hands, lifting the wooden panel free. Beneath it was darkness and the smell of old, dry space. He lit his kerosene lamp and held it over the opening. The light revealed a cavity perhaps 3 feet deep, carved into the platform foundation itself. And inside that cavity, wrapped in what appeared to be oilcloth, were objects that made Elias's breath catch in his throat. He reached in carefully and lifted out the first bundle. The oilcloth was brittle with age, but had done its job. The contents were protected. He unwrapped it slowly, and in the lamplight, gold gleamed back at him. A bar of pure gold, stamped with markings he didn't recognize, heavy as a brick and worth more than he'd earned in the last 5 years combined. There were more. He counted them as he lifted them out, his hands shaking slightly despite his attempt at steadiness. 12 gold bars in total, each one approximately the same size and weight, each wrapped individually in oilcloth and stacked carefully in the hidden space. He set them in a row on the church floor, and they caught the morning light coming through the broken windows, glowing with an almost unreal quality. His mind struggled to process what he was seeing. Gold didn't just appear in abandoned churches. This was someone's fortune, carefully hidden and apparently forgotten. Questions tumbled over each other in his thoughts. Who had hidden this? When? Why here, in a church in a dying mining town? He reached back into the cavity, his hands exploring the space to ensure he'd found everything. His fingers touched something else, not metal, but leather. He drew it out carefully. A book bound in leather that had survived better than the oilcloth, its pages protected within sturdy covers. The leather was dark brown, cracked with age, and bore no title or markings on the outside. Elias opened it carefully. The pages were yellowed but intact, covered in neat, small handwriting. The ink had faded to brown, but remained legible. He turned to the first page and read the words written there. Journal of Ezekiel Stone, begun this 15th day of March, 1887. If you're reading this, then I am gone and my secrets have outlived me. Perhaps that's for the best. A man can only carry so much weight before it crushes him, and I've carried mine long enough. The name meant nothing to Elias, but the date caught his attention. 1887, the same year this church was built, according to the county records. He continued reading, his eyes moving quickly over the careful script. I came to Redemption Flats as a preacher, a man of God bringing salvation to this rough mining camp. That's what they believe, and that's what I let them believe. The truth is more complicated, as truth usually is. I was many things before I was a preacher, and some of those things would shock the good people who sit in my pews each Sunday. Elias looked up from the journal, his gaze moving to the gold bars arranged on the floor. Understanding began to dawn, though he could scarcely believe it. He read on, flipping through pages, his eyes catching phrases and sentences that confirmed his suspicions. The Reynolds gang was my family for 8 years. We robbed trains, banks, and stages from Kansas to California. I was good at it. Smart, careful, ruthless when necessary. We took what we wanted and disappeared into the vastness of the West. By 1886, I was tired. Tired of running, tired of violence, tired of watching friends die or turn on each other. I had money hidden in various places, gold taken from our most successful robberies. I decided to become someone else, someone respectable. A preacher seemed appropriate. Who would suspect a man of God? I built this church with stolen gold, bringing salvation to a town using money taken from others. The irony isn't lost on me. Perhaps it's my penance. I preach redemption because I understand the need for it better than most. Elias sat down heavily on one of the old pews, the journal open in his hands. Ezekiel Stone, the preacher who'd built this church, had been an outlaw. The gold hidden beneath the altar wasn't a forgotten treasure. It was part of his ill-gotten gains, stashed away for safekeeping or perhaps as an emergency fund he'd never needed to access. The implications spun through Elias's mind. This gold was worth a fortune. Not enough to make him rich beyond measure, but more than enough to change his life completely. He could buy land, start over, live comfortably for his remaining years. The desperation that had driven him to this ghost town, the constant worry about his next meal and what would happen when he was too old to work, all of that could disappear. But there was more to the journal than just the preacher's confession. Elias flipped through the pages, scanning the entries. Stone had written extensively, documenting his transformation from outlaw to preacher, his thoughts on redemption and hypocrisy, his fear of discovery. And toward the back of the journal, the entries changed tone. I have hidden portions of my wealth in several locations across the territory. If my past catches up with me, these reserves will allow me to disappear again. I have marked the locations in this journal using references only I would understand. The church holds what I need for immediate security. The other locations hold enough to sustain me for many years, should I need to run again. There were descriptions, cryptic, careful, but detailed enough. References to landmarks, distances, geographic features. A treasure map written in prose rather than drawn on paper. Stone had scattered his fortune across the Southwest, pieces of it hidden and waiting for a man who had apparently died without ever needing to retrieve it. Elias closed the journal and sat in the quiet church, the morning light growing stronger around him. His hands still trembled slightly, though whether from excitement, shock, or fear, he couldn't quite say. This discovery had just transformed everything. What had been a desperate attempt to salvage some lumber for survival money had become something else entirely, an opportunity, a mystery, possibly even an adventure. But with opportunity came complications. The gold was stolen property, taken in robberies more than 40 years ago. The people it had been stolen from were likely long dead, and the money had probably been covered by insurance companies that no longer existed. Still, there would be questions about ownership, legality, claims from historical societies or government agencies. The smart thing might be to report the find, let others sort out the details. Except Elias knew what would happen then. The gold would be tied up in legal proceedings for years. He'd be lucky to see a small finder's fee, if anything at all. Meanwhile, his $7 would run out, Sadie would need to be sold, and he'd be back to looking for day labor at 62 years old with bad knees and a worse employment market. He looked at the gold bars again, gleaming in the morning light. 12 bars that could mean the difference between a desperate old age and a comfortable retirement. He thought about his father's words, about what a man does with the hours he's given. He thought about a lifetime of honest work that had somehow still left him with nothing to show for it. The decision, when it came, felt both inevitable and terrifying. He would keep the gold. He would study Stone's journal and try to understand the cryptic references to other hidden caches. And he would finally have a chance to build something lasting with whatever years remained to him. Elias stood, carefully rewrapped each gold bar in its oilcloth, and began packing them into his saddlebags. The journal he kept separate, treating it with the respect due an important document. His hands were steadier now, his mind beginning to calculate practical steps. He'd need to leave Redemption Flats soon, before anyone else took an interest in the old church. He'd need to find a way to convert the gold into usable money without raising suspicions, and he'd need to decipher Stone's journal to locate the other hidden treasures. The morning had started with him planning to tear down a church for lumber money. It was ending with him the possessor of outlaw gold and a map to even greater fortune. Life, he reflected, had a way of surprising a man just when he'd given up expecting anything but more of the same. Elias left Redemption Flats 2 hours before sunset, the gold bars distributed carefully in his saddlebags to balance Sadie's load. He'd taken one last walk through the church before departing, checking for anything else he might have missed. The building suddenly felt different to him now, not just an abandoned structure, but a monument to one man's attempt at transformation. Ezekiel Stone had built this place with stolen money, trying to construct legitimacy from ill-gotten gains. In a way, Elias was doing the same thing now, planning to build a future on gold that had been taken by force decades ago. The parallel made him uncomfortable. He'd always prided himself on honesty, on earning his way through hard work rather than shortcuts or schemes. But he also recognized that his current situation had been shaped by forces beyond his control. Corporate buyouts, an economy that had no place for aging cowboys, the simple bad luck of injuries and timing. Was it wrong to accept this unexpected windfall when he'd done nothing wrong to create his poverty? He rode south, away from the main roads, following trails he'd scouted earlier. The less attention he drew, the better. 2 men on horseback would be unremarkable. A lone rider with heavily laden saddlebags might raise questions he didn't want to answer. The territory was generally law-abiding these days, but poverty bred desperation, and desperate men took desperate actions. As evening approached, he made camp in a shallow canyon where a seasonal creek had carved protection from the wind. He built a small fire, made coffee, and pulled out Ezekiel Stone's journal. The leather felt warm in his hands, as if it had absorbed decades of desert heat and was now releasing it slowly. He opened to a middle section and began reading by firelight. Stone's handwriting remained consistent throughout, neat, controlled, the penmanship of an educated man. The entries weren't dated consistently, but they seemed to span several years, chronicling his life as Redemption Flats preacher while reflecting on his outlaw past. Today, I performed a wedding for the Kowalski girl and that young miner from Pennsylvania. They were so full of hope, so certain their love would carry them through whatever hardships came. I blessed them with words about faith and commitment, all the while knowing I'm a fraud. What right do I have to speak about virtue when I've killed men and taken what wasn't mine? Elias found himself sympathizing with Stone despite the man's criminal past. There was honesty in these private writings, a struggle with conscience that suggested the preacher had genuinely wrestled with his transformation. He hadn't been play-acting at redemption. He'd been genuinely attempting it, even while carrying the weight of his previous life. Further into the journal, Stone began referencing his hidden caches more explicitly. The Weeping Rock cache remained secure. I checked it last month during my circuit ride to the Henderson Ranch. The landmarks are unchanged, 3 juniper trees in a triangle, the rock face with the iron-stained streaks that look like tears. 30 paces due west from the center tree, buried 4 feet down in a sealed box. 20 pounds of gold coins from the Tucson stage robbery. Elias's pulse quickened. This was concrete information, geographic details he might be able to use. He pulled out a stub of pencil and a scrap of paper from his supplies and began making notes. Weeping Rock, 3 junipers in a triangle, 30 paces west, 4 feet deep, 20 pounds of gold coins. He continued reading, finding more references scattered throughout the journal's later entries. Stone had been careful never to list all his locations together, presumably in case the journal was discovered. But pieced together from multiple entries, a picture emerged of several hidden caches across the territory. Some in gold coins, others in paper money, one apparently containing jewelry taken from a bank safe. The Canyon del Muerto location troubles me. It's on Apache land, and tensions with the tribe have increased. I may never be able to retrieve that cache safely. Perhaps it will rest there forever, a tribute to the original inhabitants whose land we've stolen. There's a poetry in that. Stolen gold on stolen land, buried by a thief who became a preacher. Elias made more notes, though Canyon del Muerto sounded like exactly the sort of location he should avoid. He wasn't. young enough or foolish enough to go treasure hunting on disputed territory. But the other locations Stone mentioned, Weeping Rock, a place called Devil's Thumb, somewhere near an old Spanish mission, those might be accessible. As he read, another entry caught his attention. Stone had included a newspaper clipping, folded and pressed between the pages. Elias carefully unfolded the brittle paper. It was from the Silver City Enterprise, dated June 1884. The headline read, "Reynolds Gang Strikes Again. Express Car Robbery Nets Estimated $40,000. Below the headline was an article describing a train robbery in detail, complete with quotes from witnesses and law enforcement. And at the bottom, there was something that made Elias's breath catch. A wanted poster reproduction showing 5 men's faces sketched in the style of the era. Names were listed below: Thomas Red Reynolds, Jacob Moss, William Garrett, Samuel Diaz, and Ezekiel Stone. Elias held the paper closer to the firelight, studying Stone's sketched face. Hard eyes, strong jaw, a face that could have been handsome if not for the cold expression the artist had captured. This was the man who'd built the church, who'd written agonized journal entries about redemption and hypocrisy. The wanted poster listed him as armed and extremely dangerous. Reward, $500 per man, dead or alive. $500 had been a fortune in 1884. Men had hunted other men for far less. Stone must have lived with constant fear of recognition, knowing that any stranger might be someone who'd studied these wanted posters and was hoping for reward money. Elias refolded the clipping carefully and returned it to the journal. The weight of what he was doing settled more heavily on him. This wasn't just found money or a lucky discovery. This was the proceeds of violence taken from people who'd earned it through honest work. The fact that it had happened 4 decades ago didn't change the fundamental reality. But what was he supposed to do? Turn it over to authorities who'd tie it up in legal procedures while he starved? Try to find the descendants of robbery victims and make restitution? That was noble in theory, but impossible in practice. He didn't even know which robberies this specific gold had come from. He thought about his father again, about that pocket watch ticking steadily in his vest. His father had worked honestly all his life and died with little to show for it. Elias had followed the same path, with the same result. Maybe there was no justice in the world, no cosmic ledger ensuring good people were rewarded and bad people punished. Maybe there was just chance and circumstance, and sometimes those things put gold in your hands when you needed it most. The fire burned lower. Elias added more wood and watched the flames dance against the canyon walls. Sadie shifted nearby, comfortable after her day's travel and well-fed on the grain he'd packed. Tomorrow he'd need to make real decisions: which town to head toward, how to convert some of the gold into working cash, what his next steps should be. He opened the journal again, reading more of Stone's entries by the dying firelight. The man had been thoughtful, educated, clearly intelligent despite his violent past. His writing showed genuine remorse mixed with pragmatic acceptance of what he'd been and what he'd become. I tell my congregation that redemption is possible for anyone who truly seeks it. I want to believe that. I need to believe it because otherwise, what am I? Just a criminal in a costume, playing a role while my sins remain unchanged. But perhaps that's what redemption is, not erasing what you were, but choosing to be something different going forward. Perhaps wearing the costume long enough makes it real. Elias closed the journal and stared into the fire. He was tired from the day's travel and emotional upheaval, but his mind wouldn't settle. He'd crossed a line today, choosing to keep what wasn't rightfully his. There was no pretending otherwise, no comfortable justification that would make it purely innocent. He'd made a choice, and now he'd have to live with the consequences of that choice, whatever they turned out to be. The stars wheeled overhead, indifferent to one man's moral wrestling. Elias eventually rolled into his bedroll, the journal tucked safely in his saddlebag along with the gold. Sleep came slowly, and when it did, His dreams were troubled with images of wanted posters and churches full of gold. 3 days of careful travel brought Elias to Socorro, a town large enough to have real businesses, but small enough that a stranger wouldn't automatically draw intense scrutiny. He'd spent those days planning his approach, understanding that converting gold bars into usable money required both caution and strategy. Walking into a bank with stolen gold would be foolish. He needed an intermediary, someone who dealt in precious metals and asked few questions. He found what he was looking for in a shop tucked between a saddle maker and a boarding house. The sign above the door read, "Garrison and Sons, Assay Office, Mining Supplies, Estate Purchasing." It was the last part that had caught Elias's attention. Estate purchasing meant they bought items from people who'd inherited things they didn't want or need. Jewelry, precious metals, anything of value. A place like that would be accustomed to people bringing in gold without extensive documentation. The shop was dim after the bright street, filled with the smell of metal and dust. Glass cases displayed various items: pocket watches, rings, old coins, mining equipment. Behind the counter stood a man in his 50s, balding with spectacles perched on his nose and the careful movements of someone who'd spent a lifetime handling valuable things. "Help you?" he asked, looking up from a ledger. "Name's Elias Thorne. I've come into possession of some gold I'm looking to sell." The man's expression didn't change, but his eyes sharpened with interest. "I'm Henry Garrison. What sort of gold are we discussing?" "Bars, high quality from what I can tell, though I'm no expert." "I see. May I examine them?" Elias had anticipated this. He'd brought only one bar with him, wrapped in canvas and carried in an inside coat pocket. He placed it on the counter carefully. Garrison unwrapped it, his movements deliberate, and held it up to the light from the window. "Interesting," he murmured. He carried it to a workbench where various tools and instruments were arranged. Elias watched as Garrison produced a small scale, the kind with brass pans that hung from a central beam. The assayer placed the gold bar on one pan and began adding calibrated weights to the other until they balanced. "Approximately 14 troy ounces," Garrison said. He made a mark on the bar with a small file, examining the fresh scratch closely. Then he applied drops of liquid from various bottles, watching the metal's reaction. Elias knew he was testing the gold's purity, but the specific process was beyond his knowledge. 23-carat gold, Garrison said finally. "Very high quality. Where did you say this came from?" "Estate sale," Elias replied, the lie prepared and delivered calmly. "Old family property up north. Had it sitting in a safety deposit box for years, according to the paperwork." And there's more. 11 more bars just like that one." Garrison removed his spectacles and cleaned them carefully with a cloth, his face thoughtful. "That's a significant amount of gold. Are you looking to sell all of it?" "Eventually. But I understand selling it all at once might raise questions or draw attention I'd prefer to avoid." A slight smile crossed Garrison's face. "You're not wrong about that. Large gold transactions get reported to federal authorities these days. Treasury regulations." He replaced his spectacles. "I could take one bar now, pay you fair market value minus my commission. If you're satisfied with the transaction, you could bring another in a few weeks, then another after that. Spacing them out would be prudent." "What's fair market value?" Garrison calculated on a piece of paper. "Gold's trading around $35 an ounce currently. 14 ounces at 23-carat purity, minus my 20% commission, comes to about $390. Elias kept his face neutral, though the number stunned him. Nearly $400 for one bar, with 11 more waiting. That was more than he'd earned in the best year of his working life. "That seems reasonable. I can pay you now if you'd like. Cash money. Half now, half when I return in 2 weeks with another bar. That way we both have incentive to deal fairly." Garrison nodded approvingly. Smart. I can work with that. He went to a safe in the corner, worked the combination, and withdrew a cash box. Elias watched him count out $195 in bills of various denominations. The balance when you return. Elias took the money, folded it carefully, and tucked it into his vest pocket next to his father's watch. It was more cash than he'd held in years, and it represented only half payment for 1 bar out of 12. The enormity of his discovery was finally becoming real. One more thing, Garrison said as Elias turned to leave. That gold you've got, the markings on it are unusual. Not U.S. mint work, possibly private refinery or foreign origin. You might want to be careful about the story you tell regarding its provenance. Some people might ask uncomfortable questions. Elias met his eyes. I appreciate the advice. Just a word from one businessman to another. Good luck with your estate matters. Outside, Elias stood on the wooden sidewalk, letting his eyes adjust to the sunlight. He had money now, real, usable money that would buy food, supplies, and time to plan his next moves. But Garrison's warning about the gold's markings worried him. If someone with knowledge examined those bars closely, they might be able to trace them back to specific robberies. The Reynolds gang's activities had been well documented in their time. There might be records, evidence, connections that could unravel his entire story. He found a hotel and paid for a week's stay, a luxury he hadn't been able to afford in months. The room was small but clean, with a real bed and a window overlooking the street. He secured his saddlebags in the room, kept Stone's journal on his person, and went down to the hotel restaurant for a proper meal. Over steak and potatoes, he reviewed his situation. He had cash money and a way to convert more gold safely, though slowly. He had Stone's journal with references to additional hidden caches. He had time now, purchased with that first gold bar, to study the journal properly and make plans. But he also had new worries. Garrison had been honest about the gold's unusual markings. Others might not be so helpful, and if word got around that he was selling significant amounts of gold, questions would multiply. He needed to be smarter, more careful. Maybe Socorro was too close to Redemption Flats. Maybe he should travel farther, establish himself somewhere else before converting more bars. That evening in his hotel room, Elias spread out the pages of notes he'd been making from Stone's journal. He'd identified 5 possible cache locations so far, each with varying degrees of detail. Weeping Rock sounded most promising. Specific landmarks, clear directions, relatively accessible territory. Devil's Thumb was less certain, the description more vague. The Spanish mission location might not even exist anymore, as many old missions had been abandoned or destroyed. He pulled out the wanted poster again, studying the faces sketched there. These men had been dangerous, violent, willing to kill for money. Stone's journal revealed glimpses of that life. The planning of robberies, the division of spoils, the narrow escapes from law enforcement. Yet Stone had also written about fear, about watching friends die, about the grinding pressure of always running, always looking over his shoulder. We thought we were free, one entry read, taking what we wanted, living by our own rules, no bosses or authority to answer to. But we were prisoners of our own choices, trapped by the need to keep moving, keep hiding, keep our secrets. I was more free as a preacher in a dying mining town than I ever was as an outlaw with gold in my pockets. Elias understood that now in ways he couldn't have a week ago. The gold had solved his immediate problems, but it had also created new ones. He'd have to be careful, cautious, always aware that discovery could cost him everything. It wasn't so different from Stone's situation, living with secrets, carrying the weight of decisions that couldn't be undone. He checked his father's watch. Nearly midnight. Outside, Socorro had quieted down for the night, just the occasional sound of footsteps or a distant dog barking. Elias laid out his plans for tomorrow. purchase supplies, send a telegram to Ben Calhoun letting him know he was doing better, maybe visit the library to research territorial geography. If he was going to search for Stone's other caches, he needed maps and knowledge. Before sleep, he read one more journal entry, this one near the book's end. I've been the preacher of Redemption Flats for 11 years now. The town is dying, silver production has dropped, families are moving away, businesses are closing. Soon this place will be empty, and my church will stand alone in a ghost town. Perhaps that's fitting. A monument built by a ghost of a man I used to be, waiting for someone else to discover its secrets. If you're reading this, stranger, I hope you use what you find more wisely than I used what I took. Elias closed the journal and extinguished the lamp. In the darkness, he could hear his own breathing and the steady tick of the pocket watch. Stone had left him more than gold. He'd left a map, a warning, and a question about redemption that Elias was only beginning to understand. The Socorro Library was housed in a stone building that had once been a territorial courthouse. Inside, the air smelled of old paper and leather bindings, a scent Elias associated with knowledge accumulated over generations. The librarian, a woman named Mrs. Patterson, who looked to be about his age, directed him to the geography section with the quiet efficiency of someone who loved her work. "Are you looking for anything specific?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper in the library's respectful silence. "Old territorial maps. Survey records if you have them. I'm researching historical sites for a project." She brightened at that. "We have an excellent collection. The territory was thoroughly surveyed in the 1870s and 80s. What region are you interested in?" "Southwest Territory, particularly areas around old mining towns and mission sites." She led him to a large cabinet with wide, flat drawers. "These are our map archives. Please handle them carefully. Some are quite fragile." She pulled open a drawer revealing maps rolled and labeled. "These cover the period between 1870 and 1895. If you need help identifying specific features, just ask." Elias spent the next 3 hours hunched over a reading table, carefully examining maps and cross-referencing them with Stone's journal entries. The journal's descriptions were precise enough to be useful, but vague enough to require interpretation. When Stone mentioned Weeping Rock, he hadn't provided coordinates or township references, just natural landmarks that would have been obvious to someone familiar with the territory. Elias found Weeping Rock on a survey map dated 1881. It was labeled as Painted Rock Formation on the map, but the description matched, a distinctive outcropping with iron oxide staining that appeared like rust-colored streaks running down the face. The map showed it was about 40 miles northwest of Socorro, in relatively open country near what had once been a stage line route. He made careful notes, sketching the surrounding geography from the map. Stone had mentioned 3 juniper trees in a triangle formation. Those probably wouldn't be marked on any map, but knowing the general area would let him search on foot. 30 paces west from the center tree, 4 feet down, 20 pounds of gold coins. The Spanish mission location was harder. Stone's description was poetic, but imprecise. Where the river bends back on itself like a serpent, the old mission stands in ruins. The stones remember prayers in Spanish, and the gold remembers nothing at all. Elias found several old missions marked on various maps, but identifying which one matched Stone's description would require visiting them, and that could take weeks. Devil's Thumb was clearer. It was a distinctive rock formation marked on a geological survey map as a prominent landmark used by travelers and traders. The formation resembled a hand giving a thumbs-up gesture when viewed from the east, hence the name. Stone's journal indicated a cache hidden in the shadow of the thumb, where water once flowed but now runs dry. Follow the old streambed north for 200 paces to a cluster of boulders. The third boulder from the south can be moved by one strong man. Behind it, 3 feet into the hillside, sealed in iron. Elias studied that map closely. Devil's Thumb was about 60 miles due east of Socorro, in rougher terrain than Weeping Rock. It would require more time and effort to reach, but the detailed description suggested Stone had been confident about this hiding place. As he worked, Mrs. Patterson brought him additional resources, a book about territorial geology, a collection of surveyors' notes from the 1880s, even a folder of old newspaper clippings about notable landmarks. She seemed delighted to have someone so genuinely interested in historical research. "Are you a historian?" she asked during one of her visits to his table. "Not professionally, just someone with an interest in how the territory developed." "It's wonderful to see. So much history gets forgotten if people don't take the time to preserve and study it." She hesitated, then added, "We have some materials about the outlaws who operated in the territory during that period, if that's of interest. The Reynolds gang, the Cassidy outfit, others. They were part of our history too, though perhaps not the most proud part." Elias felt his pulse quicken, but kept his expression neutral. "That might be useful context. Thank you." She returned with a leather-bound volume titled Territorial Crime and Law Enforcement, 1875-1895. Elias opened it carefully, scanning the table of contents. There was an entire chapter on the Reynolds gang. The chapter detailed the gang's activities over nearly a decade: train robberies, bank holdups, stagecoach raids. The author had been thorough, including dates, locations, estimated amounts stolen, and outcomes of various law enforcement efforts to capture the gang members. There were also photographs, crude reproductions of the wanted posters Elias had already seen in Stone's journal. Reading about Stone's crimes in this clinical, historical format made them more real somehow. The Tucson stage robbery that Stone had mentioned in his journal was documented here. September 18, 1882. Reynolds' gang stopped the Butterfield stage 12 miles west of Tucson. 5 masked men, heavily armed. Took approximately $8,000 in gold coins and currency. Driver wounded, 1 passenger killed when he attempted resistance. Gang escaped south toward Mexican border. 1 passenger killed. Elias felt that detail like a physical weight. This wasn't just about stolen gold anymore. People had died during these robberies. Stone had been part of that violence, had participated in actions that ended lives and destroyed families. His later remorse, documented so carefully in his journal, couldn't change those facts. Elias continued reading. The book mentioned that by 1886, the Reynolds gang had largely disappeared. Thomas Reynolds was killed in a shootout with territorial rangers in March 1886. Of the remaining gang members, Jacob Moss died of fever that same year. William Garrett was captured and hanged in 1887. Samuel Diaz escaped to Mexico and was never apprehended. Ezekiel Stone simply vanished, presumed dead or living under an assumed identity. Stone hadn't just vanished. He'd transformed himself into a preacher and built a church in a dying mining town. It had worked. He'd lived out his remaining years in relative peace, his past unknown to the people who trusted him with their spiritual guidance. Elias closed the book and sat back, rubbing his eyes. The afternoon had passed quickly, and the library would be closing soon. He'd learned what he needed about geography and routes, but he'd also learned more about the man whose fortune he now possessed. It complicated things, made the moral questions sharper and less easy to dismiss. Mrs. Patterson approached again. "Find what you needed?" "Yes, thank you. You've been very helpful. Will you be back? We're open Tuesday through Saturday, 9 to 5. "Probably. I'm working on a longer project." She smiled. "Wonderful. It's nice to see someone doing proper research rather than just asking quick questions and leaving." Outside, the evening air was cooling, pleasant after the day's heat. Elias walked back toward his hotel, his mind full of maps and distances and moral complications. He had the information he needed to search for Weeping Rock and Devil's Thumb. With careful planning and good luck, he might be able to recover those caches within a few weeks, but he also couldn't escape the knowledge of how that gold had been obtained. Real people had been robbed, hurt, killed. The money Stone had hidden represented genuine suffering and loss. Using it felt different now that he understood its origin so clearly. At the hotel, he found Sadie settled in the livery stable, well-fed and comfortable. He spent time with her, brushing her coat and speaking to her in the low, steady voice she knew. Horses didn't judge a man's moral choices. They just needed care, consistency, and kindness. That evening, Elias laid out his maps and notes on the hotel room bed. Weeping Rock was closest, most accessible. He could reach it in 2 days of steady riding, search for the cache, and return to Socorro within a week. If he found nothing, he'd only lost time and effort. If he found the 20 pounds of gold coin Stone described, he'd have confirmation that the journal's other references were accurate. He calculated supplies, routes, contingencies. His father's watch showed 11:30. Tomorrow he'd purchase provisions and prepare for travel. He was committed now, for better or worse. The gold he'd already found had pushed him past the point of turning back. He might as well see where this path led, even if he wasn't entirely comfortable with the direction. Before sleep, he read one more entry from Stone's journal. I wonder sometimes if I'm just running still, even though I stand behind a pulpit instead of a gun. Have I truly changed, or have I just found a better hiding place? Perhaps transformation isn't about becoming someone completely different, but about choosing different actions despite being the same person underneath. Perhaps that's the best any of us can do. Elias understood that sentiment better with each passing day. He was still the same man who'd bought a church for $90, planning to salvage lumber. But his actions from this point forward would define what that man became next. The journey to Weeping Rock took 2.5 days of steady travel through terrain that shifted from scrubland to rocky hills studded with juniper and pinyon pine. Elias navigated using a brass compass he'd purchased in Socorro, along with the maps he'd copied from the library. The compass had belonged to an old surveyor, according to the shop owner who'd sold it to him, and it bore scratches and dents from decades of field use. Something about that appealed to Elias. Tools that had served their purpose well and still had more to give. He traveled during the cooler morning and evening hours, resting during the afternoon heat. Sadie handled the terrain with her usual reliability, picking her way over rough ground with the sure-footedness that came from years of varied experience. They saw no one else during the journey, which suited Elias fine. The fewer people who knew his business or could place him in this area, the better. On the afternoon of the 3rd day, he spotted the distinctive rock formation rising from the landscape like a monument. The iron oxide staining was exactly as described. Rust-red streaks running down the weathered gray stone face, giving the appearance of tears or blood depending on how the light struck it. Weeping Rock. He felt a strange satisfaction at having successfully interpreted Stone's directions and the old survey maps. He made camp in the shadow of the formation, taking his time to prepare a proper meal and rest before beginning his search. Tomorrow morning, with fresh eyes and good light, he'd look for the 3 juniper trees Stone had described. The compass would help him orient properly once he found them. That night, sleep came fitfully. He kept thinking about what might be waiting beneath the ground, or what might not be there at all. Stone's journal entry was 40 years old. The junipers might have died, the landmarks changed, the gold already discovered by someone else. He was chasing information from a dead outlaw based on cryptic journal entries. The entire enterprise seemed half mad when he thought about it clearly. But he'd come this far, and the 12 gold bars he'd found in the church proved Stone's hidden caches were real. The man had been careful, methodical. If he said there was gold at Weeping Rock, there was good reason to believe him. Morning came clear and cool. Elias ate quickly, saddled Sadie, and began systematically searching the area around Weeping Rock. Stone had mentioned the junipers were within sight of the rock's southern face, which narrowed the search area significantly. He rode in expanding circles, scanning the landscape for 3 trees positioned in a triangular formation. 2 hours into his search, he found them. 3 juniper trees, ancient and gnarled, forming an almost perfect triangle about 30 feet on each side. They stood on a slight rise, perhaps 200 yards from Weeping Rock's southern face. Elias dismounted and walked among them, his heart beating faster despite his attempt at calm. He stood at what he estimated was the center point of the triangle, pulled out his compass, and oriented himself. 30 paces due west. He counted carefully, his stride deliberately measured. At 30 paces, he marked the spot with a stone cairn, then began searching for any sign that the ground had been disturbed. Nothing obvious presented itself. 4 decades of wind, rain, and natural settling had erased any trace of digging. But Stone had buried the cache 4 feet down. That was deep enough that the surface might show no evidence. Elias would have to trust the directions and dig. He'd brought a folding spade, adequate for the task, but not ideal. Real excavation work required better tools, but those would have been suspicious to purchase and difficult to transport. He began digging, removing the top layer of sandy soil mixed with rock and sparse vegetation. The work was hard. The ground was harder than it appeared, packed solid by time and the infrequent rains that fell in this country. His bad shoulder began aching after the first hour, and his hands developed blisters despite his calluses. But he kept at it, methodically deepening the hole, piling the excavated dirt nearby. 2 feet down, his spade struck something solid. His pulse jumped. He dug more carefully around the obstruction, clearing dirt away with his hands. Rock. Just a natural stone, disappointingly ordinary. He worked around it and continued digging. 3 feet, 3.5. Nothing but more dirt and occasional stones. Doubt crept in. Maybe he'd miscounted the paces. Maybe the center of the triangle wasn't where he'd calculated. Maybe Stone's memory had been faulty when he'd written the journal entry. At 4 feet, the spade hit something that sounded different from rock. A hollow thud, like wood. Elias's hands shook slightly as he cleared the dirt away more carefully. Yes, wood. A box, maybe 2 feet long and a foot wide, made from what looked like cedar. The wood had weathered but remained intact, preserved by the dry climate and its depth underground. He cleared around it completely, working the spade beneath it to loosen the surrounding soil. Then he carefully lifted the box from its resting place and set it on the ground beside the hole. It was heavy, very heavy, the weight of gold. The box was secured with a rusted padlock. Elias examined it, then used his pry bar to break the hasp free. The lock fell away, and he opened the lid slowly, almost reverently. Gold coins gleamed in the morning sunlight. Hundreds of them, maybe thousands, filling the box nearly to the top. They were mostly double eagles, $20 gold pieces, along with some $10 eagles and other denominations. Elias reached in and picked up a handful, letting them run through his fingers. Each coin was heavy, solid, real. Stone hadn't lied. The cash was exactly where he'd said it would be, exactly what he'd described. 20 pounds of gold coins, probably more if Elias had to guess. At current gold prices, this box contained a fortune, several $1,000s at least. He sat back on his heels, staring at the open box. Relief mixed with exhilaration, mixed with a creeping sense of unreality. He'd actually found it. He'd followed a dead outlaw's directions and recovered treasure that had been buried before he was born. It seemed like something from a dime novel rather than actual life. But the weight of the coins in his hand was undeniably real. This was happening. He'd just increased his wealth significantly, and if Stone's other cached locations were equally accurate, there was more to be found. Elias worked quickly now, refilling the hole and scattering the excess dirt to make the site less obvious. He transferred the coins from the cedar box to his saddlebags, distributing the weight carefully. The box itself he broke apart and scattered, unwilling to leave evidence of what he'd found. By early afternoon, he was ready to travel. The site looked largely undisturbed to a casual eye, and he'd memorized the landmarks well enough that he could return if needed, though he had no intention of ever coming back here. The ride back to Socorro felt different. He was no longer gambling on possibilities. He was traveling with proven wealth, with confirmation that Stone's journal was a reliable guide to more fortune. The weight in his saddlebags was literal now, a physical burden that slowed Sadie's pace but represented security Elias hadn't felt in years. He made camp that evening in a defensive position, a cluster of rocks that provided cover and clear sight lines in all directions. He'd become acutely aware that he was now carrying enough gold to make him a target. People had killed for far less. He kept his rifle close and slept lightly, waking at every sound. The second day of return travel passed without incident. He reached Socorro as evening fell, returned Sadie to the livery stable, and carried his saddlebags to his hotel room with as much casualness as he could manage. Only when the door was locked and the window shade drawn did he allow himself to relax. He counted the coins carefully, organizing them by denomination. 247 double eagles, 98 $10 eagles. Smaller denominations accounting for another few $100s. All told, the cash was worth approximately $6,300 at face value, and probably more if sold to collectors interested in historical coins. Combined with the gold bars from the church, Elias now possessed wealth that exceeded anything he'd imagined in his life. He was, by any reasonable standard, rich, not tycoon rich, not railroad baron rich, but more than comfortable. Enough to buy property, live well, never worry about his next meal again. The responsible thing would be to stop now. He had enough. But Stone's journal described other caches. Devil's Thumb, the Spanish Mission, possibly more. And now that Elias had confirmed the journal's accuracy, the temptation to search for the rest was overwhelming. If one cache had been this straightforward to find, why not pursue the others? He closed his eyes, the weight of decision pressing on him. He knew he was rationalizing, finding reasons to continue something he knew was morally questionable at best. But he also knew, with a certainty that went beyond logic, that he would search for the other caches. He'd crossed too many lines already to stop now. He might as well see where this path led, even if the destination remained uncertain. Elias was preparing to leave Socorro for Devil's Thumb when Henry Garrison sent word requesting a meeting. The message came via a boy who worked errands for the assay office, delivered to Elias's hotel with the simple note, "Matter of importance regarding your estate items. Please visit at your earliest convenience. H.G." The formal tone made Elias uneasy. He'd planned to sell another gold bar before leaving town, spacing out the transactions as they'd discussed, but something about the message suggested more than routine business. He checked his father's watch. 2:15 in the afternoon. He tucked Stone's journal securely in his coat's inner pocket, checked that his revolver was loaded, and headed to Garrison's shop. The assayer was alone when Elias entered, standing behind his counter with an expression that mixed concern and curiosity. "Mr. Thorne, thank you for coming. Your message said it was important." "It is." Garrison gestured toward the back of the shop. "Please, come into my office. This conversation requires privacy." The office was small and cluttered with ledgers, sample boxes, and mining equipment. Garrison closed the door and indicated a chair. He sat behind his desk, opened a drawer, and withdrew something wrapped in cloth. When he unwrapped it, Elias recognized one of the gold bars, the one he'd sold 2 weeks earlier. "I've had an interesting visit," Garrison began, his tone careful. 2 days ago, a man came into my shop asking questions about old gold bars. Specifically, he was looking for bars matching certain descriptions: weight, purity, markings. He had photographs of the markings from historical records. Elias felt his stomach tighten. What sort of man? Professional type, well-dressed, educated speech. He said he was a researcher working for a historical society, documenting the Reynolds gang's activities and trying to recover artifacts related to their crimes. He's been tracking the gang's stolen gold for years, apparently. Did you tell him about my bar? No, not yet, but he left these. Garrison placed several photographs on the desk. They showed gold bars with markings identical to the ones on Elias's bars, the same stamps, the same dimensions. These came from a train robbery in 1883. The Reynolds gang hit a private mint shipment heading to California. Took nearly 50 bars exactly like yours. Elias studied the photographs, his mind working through implications. You said you haven't told him yet. I said I'd keep my eyes open and contact him if anything relevant came through my business. He left contact information, an address in Santa Fe and a telegraph office where messages can be sent. Garrison leaned back in his chair. The thing is, Mr. Thorne, I've been in this business for 30 years. I've dealt with stolen property before, usually without meaning to. And I've learned to recognize when a man's story doesn't quite fit the goods he's selling. I came by those bars, honestly. Garrison held up a hand. I'm not accusing you of anything, but I'm telling you that someone with resources and determination is actively looking for this specific gold. If you're planning to sell more bars, especially through legitimate channels, you need to be aware that questions will eventually catch up to you. What's this researcher's name? Marcus Webb. He seemed sincere about his historical mission, but he also mentioned that Reynolds gang gold would be worth considerably more to collectors than standard bullion value. He's not just documenting history, he's hunting valuable artifacts. Elias absorbed this information. Marcus Webb, a researcher who knew enough to identify the gold by its markings and who had the resources to track it across territory. This changed everything. The gold wasn't as anonymous as Elias had hoped. Someone with knowledge could trace it, identify its origins, potentially connect it back to Ezekiel Stone and Redemption Flats. Why are you telling me this? Elias asked. Garrison's expression was hard to read. Because you've been straight with me, and I appreciate that. Because I don't particularly care about helping historical societies recover property from robberies that happened before I was born. And because, he hesitated, because I was young once and desperate, and I understand what it's like to see opportunity when you've got nothing else. I appreciate your discretion. I'm not doing it for free. If you're going to sell more bars, I need a better story about provenance. Something that would satisfy questions if they come up, and my commission goes to 30% instead of 20%. It was borderline extortion, but Elias was in no position to object. Agreed. Good. Now, there's something else. Garrison pulled out another item. An old leather wallet, cracked with age. This came with your gold bar when you first brought it. Fell out of the canvas wrapping. I set it aside, meaning to mention it, but forgot until now. Elias took the wallet, his hands suddenly cold. He opened it carefully. Inside was a folded paper, yellowed and brittle. He unfolded it slowly, revealing handwriting he recognized, Ezekiel Stone's precise script. To whoever finds this, I leave these words as both confession and warning. My name was Ezekiel Stone, though I lived my last years as Reverend Josiah Pierce of Redemption Flats. I was an outlaw who attempted redemption by building a church with stolen gold. Whether I succeeded is not for me to judge. Elias's pulse hammered in his ears as he continued reading. The gold you have found represents my share of crimes I cannot undo. I've hidden more throughout the territory, locations detailed in my journal. But know this, I was not the only one who knew where this gold was placed. Samuel Diaz, my former partner, also knows. We made a pact in 1886. If either of us tried to retrieve the caches, the other would know. Samuel disappeared into Mexico, but I have reason to believe he survived and may someday return for what he considers his rightful share. The letter continued. I die today by my own hand, unable to bear the weight of my deceptions any longer. The gold is cursed by the blood it cost, and whoever seeks it will find that curse follows them. If you are reading this, you have already taken the first step down a path I could not escape. May you fare better than I did. The letter was dated November 8, 1898, and signed simply E.S. Elias looked up at Garrison. Did you read this? I did. I'm sorry, I should have given it to you immediately, but curiosity got the better of me. He paused. So, Ezekiel Stone was real, not just a name in history books, and apparently he had a partner who might still be alive and looking for this gold. Samuel Diaz. The journal I found mentioned him. According to the letter, Stone died by suicide. If that's true, and if Diaz learns that Stone is dead, he might come looking for caches he believes are his by right. Garrison's expression was grave. You're not just dealing with a historical researcher, Mr. Thorne. You might be dealing with an old outlaw who has decades of violence behind him and nothing left to lose. The implications stacked up in Elias's mind. Marcus Webb searching for Reynolds gang artifacts. Samuel Diaz, potentially still alive and aware of the hidden caches. Stone's letter suggesting some kind of pact or system that would alert Diaz if the gold was moved. Every cache Elias recovered increased the chance of drawing attention from people far more dangerous than a researcher. The smart thing would be to walk away, Garrison said quietly. Take what you've already got, convert it slowly and carefully, and forget about the rest. Yes, Elias agreed. That would be smart. But you're not going to do that. No. Garrison shook his head slowly. I figured as much. I saw it in your eyes when you first brought that gold bar in. A man who's got nothing and suddenly sees everything, that man doesn't walk away. He stood and moved to a cabinet, withdrawing a bottle of whiskey and 2 glasses. At least have a drink with me before you chase after whatever comes next. They drank in silence, the whiskey burning down Elias's throat and settling warm in his stomach. The letter from Stone lay on the desk between them, a message from a dead man to whoever would follow his path. Stone had called the gold cursed, had warned about Samuel Diaz, had ultimately chosen death over continuing to carry his secrets. But Stone had also been a man who'd successfully hidden his past for years, who'd built a church and lived as a respected preacher. He'd transformed himself once. Perhaps it was possible to take his gold without also taking his fate. One more thing, Garrison said as Elias prepared to leave. That researcher, Marcus Webb, mentioned he'd be in the area for at least another month. He's interviewing old-timers, visiting historical sites, gathering information. If you're moving around the territory looking for more caches, there's a chance you might cross paths with him. I'll keep that in mind. And, Mr. Thorne, if you do find more gold and need someone to help convert it, I'm willing to continue our arrangement. But be careful. There's a difference between taking a risk and walking into a trap. Outside, the afternoon sun seemed too bright, the street too normal. Elias walked slowly back to his hotel, Stone's letter folded carefully in his pocket along with the journal. Everything had changed in the space of an hour. What had seemed like a straightforward treasure hunt, morally questionable but practically simple, had become something more complex and dangerous. Samuel Diaz might be out there, somewhere. Marcus Webb was definitely in the territory, actively searching for Reynolds gang gold, and Elias was carrying enough stolen treasure to make him a target for either man. He should stop. He knew that with absolute certainty. The gold bars from the church, plus the coins from Weeping Rock, that was enough to ensure his security for life. Going after Devil's Thumb or the other caches was greed, pure and simple. But Stone's letter had also contained something else, a map reference Elias hadn't seen in the journal. The Devil's Thumb cache contains more than gold. It contains the truth about our final job, the one that split the gang and sent me running for my soul. If you seek to understand why this gold is cursed, you'll find your answers there. What truth? What final job? The book he'd read in the library had mentioned the gang splitting up in 1886, but gave no details about why. Stone's letter suggested there was more to the story, something important enough to mention in what he believed were his final words. Elias climbed the stairs to his hotel room slowly, his mind full of decisions and consequences. He'd found Stone's gold, and in doing so, he'd also found Stone's warnings, his partner's shadow, and a researcher's quest. The path forward was no longer clear, if it ever had been. But as he lay in bed that night, watching shadows play across the ceiling, he knew he would continue. Not just for the gold, though that was part of it. He needed to know what truth Stone had hidden at Devil's Thumb. He needed to understand what had driven a man to build a church with stolen gold and then take his own life rather than live with his secrets. Maybe in understanding Stone's story, Elias would better understand his own choices and where they were leading him. Or maybe he was just rationalizing a decision he'd already made. Either way, tomorrow he would prepare for the journey to Devil's Thumb, warnings and risks notwithstanding. Stone's watch, no, his father's watch, ticked steadily in the darkness. Time moved forward whether you were ready or not. All a man could do was make his choices and face what came next. Elias spent 3 days preparing for Devil's Thumb, and those days felt like walking a tightrope between caution and paranoia. Every stranger who glanced his direction might be Marcus Webb. Every rider who took the same road might be following him. The weight of Stone's warning about Samuel Diaz pressed on him constantly, a reminder that violence from the past could reach into the present without warning. He purchased supplies methodically, spreading his acquisitions across multiple shops to avoid drawing attention. Rope, additional ammunition, a better spade, dried food, medical supplies. He also bought a second holster and belt, keeping his father's Navy Colt accessible, but adding a newer model Colt revolver that the shop owner assured him was reliable. If trouble found him at Devil's Thumb, he intended to be prepared. The evening before departure, Elias sat in his hotel room reorganizing his possessions. The gold bars were too heavy and conspicuous to carry on this trip. He arranged for the hotel manager to store them in the building's safe, paying extra for discretion and security. The coins from Weeping Rock he divided into multiple pouches, distributing them in his saddlebags and on his person so that no single loss would be catastrophic. Stone's journal he kept close, along with a letter found in the wallet. He'd read both documents dozens of times now, searching for any detail he might have missed. The journal entries about Devil's Thumb were more extensive than those about Weeping Rock, as if Stone had considered this cache particularly important. Devil's Thumb rises like God's own finger pointing at heaven, though there's nothing holy about what I've buried there. The formation is unmistakable. Approach from the east at dawn and you'll see why it earned its name. The shadow of the thumb falls across a dry stream bed that once ran with snow melt, but has been dry for decades. Follow that stream bed north, counting your paces. At 200, you'll find boulders clustered like a giant's fist. The third boulder from the south appears immovable, but leverage applied correctly will shift it. Behind, a cavity extends 3 feet into the hillside. I sealed it with iron plating to protect against animals and weather. But it was Stone's additional notes that had drawn Elias's attention. I've hidden more than gold at Devil's Thumb. The complete record of our final job, the Kansas City Federal Reserve train, is sealed there along with my share of the take. Thomas Reynolds died because of that job, and the guilt of it drove me from outlaw life to this charade of redemption. If anyone ever finds this cache, they'll understand why some gold carries too high a price. The Kansas City Federal Reserve train robbery. Elias had found brief mention of it in the library book, but the details were sparse. The robbery had occurred in February 1886, just weeks before the Reynolds gang had dissolved. Estimated take, over $200,000 in gold and currency, one of the largest robberies in territorial history. 3 law enforcement officers killed, along with the train's engineer. A bloodbath that had triggered a massive manhunt and ultimately led to Thomas Reynolds' death in a shootout with Rangers. Stone had been part of that. The genial preacher who'd written philosophical reflections in his journal had also participated in a robbery that left 4 men dead. The contradiction was difficult to reconcile, yet it was the truth. Elias closed the journal and checked his father's watch. 9:40. He should sleep. Tomorrow would be a long day's ride. But his mind was too active, turning over possibilities and problems. He was 62 years old, with bad knees and a worse shoulder, riding into rough country to recover stolen gold while potentially being tracked by a historical researcher and a possibly living outlaw partner. The absurdity of his situation struck him suddenly, and he found himself laughing, a short, bitter sound in the quiet room. What would his father think, the man who'd carried this pocket watch for 50 years, who'd worked honest jobs and died with little to show for it? Would he be proud that his son had finally found fortune, or ashamed at how it had been obtained? The question had no answer, which somehow made it worse. Sleep came eventually, troubled with dreams of churches filled with gold and wanted posters with his own face sketched on them. Morning arrived with the kind of clear, cold dawn that promised heat later. Elias was saddled and riding before the town fully woke, heading east on trails that grew rougher as the terrain shifted from scrubland to broken country of stone formations and sparse vegetation. He saw occasional riders in the distance, but encountered no one directly. By late afternoon of the second day, Devil's Thumb came into view. The formation was exactly as Stone had described, a massive rock column rising perhaps 60 feet above the surrounding landscape, with an upper section that jutted at an angle resembling a hand giving a thumbs-up gesture. From the eastern approach, the resemblance was unmistakable. It would have served as an excellent landmark for travelers and traders in the old days. Elias made camp a mile from the formation, in a defensive position among rocks that provided cover and good sight lines. He didn't build a fire. The evening was warm enough, and flames would be visible for miles in this open country. He ate cold food and drank from his canteen while watching the sun paint Devil's Thumb in shades of orange and red. As darkness fell, he studied the landscape with his brass surveyor's compass, orienting himself for tomorrow's search. The dry streambed Stone mentioned was visible, running roughly north-south past the formation's western side. He'd need to find the exact point where the thumb's shadow fell across it, then follow it north 200 paces to the boulder cluster. He slept poorly, waking multiple times to check his surroundings. Each sound, wind, small animals, the settling of rocks cooling in the night air, brought him fully alert with his hand on his revolver. By the time dawn arrived, he was exhausted, but too wired to feel it. He approached Devil's Thumb as the sun rose, positioning himself to observe where the shadow fell. The formation's shadow was long in the early morning light, stretching across the streambed exactly as Stone had described. Elias marked the spot mentally and began counting paces north along the ancient watercourse. The streambed was easy to follow, a depression carved through stone and packed earth, littered with rocks rounded by water that no longer flowed. His boots crunched on gravel. Sadie followed at his shoulder, patient as always. At 180 paces, he slowed, scanning ahead for the boulder cluster. At 195, he saw them, a collection of large rocks that indeed resembled a fist pressed against the hillside. He counted carefully. 200 paces, right at the base of the cluster. Third boulder from the south, he murmured, studying the formation. The boulders were substantial, each one probably weighing several tons. Stone had said one could be moved by one strong man, but that seemed unlikely for rocks this size, unless there was a trick to it. Elias circled the cluster carefully, examining each boulder for signs of artificial placement or modification. The third boulder from the south was roughly oval, perhaps 8 feet tall and 5 feet across at its widest. It rested against the hillside at an angle that looked natural, but might not be. He put his shoulder against it and pushed. Nothing. He tried from different angles, testing for give or movement. Still nothing. Frustration began building. Had Stone's memory been faulty? Had the landscape shifted in 40 years? Then he noticed it, a depression at the boulder's base, partially hidden by smaller rocks and debris. He cleared away the obstruction and found a gap, perhaps 8 inches high, running underneath the boulder. Not enough to see through, but enough to insert a lever. Elias retrieved his pry bar from Sadie's pack and worked it into the gap. He positioned himself carefully, using his weight and leverage rather than raw strength. The boulder shifted slightly with a grinding sound. He adjusted position and tried again. More movement, the massive rock pivoting on some kind of fulcrum beneath it. Understanding dawned. Stone had rigged this boulder on a balance point. It looked immovable, but was actually positioned to swing aside with the right application of leverage. Clever. Someone searching without knowing the trick would assume it was naturally placed and move on. Elias continued working the pry bar, gradually shifting the boulder. After 15 minutes of effort, he'd moved it far enough to reveal what lay behind. A dark opening in the hillside, roughly 3 feet square, sealed with what appeared to be an iron plate. The plate was secured with bolts that had rusted over the decades. Elias worked at them with his tools, breaking 2 before the others finally loosened. The plate came free with a metallic screech, revealing a cavity extending back into the hillside. He lit his kerosene lamp and held it into the opening. The lamplight reflected off metal surfaces. More sealed containers, larger than the cedar box at Weeping Rock. And there was something else, wrapped in oilcloth and tied with cord that had resisted time better than expected. Elias crawled partway into the cavity, his bad shoulder protesting the awkward position. He pulled out the first container, an iron strongbox, locked and heavy, then another, equally substantial. And finally, the oilcloth package, which crinkled with age as he handled it. Outside in the morning light, he examined his finds. The strong boxes were quality work, built to protect their contents from the elements and thieves. The locks were solid but old. He used his tools to break them, feeling only a moment's guilt at destroying what was likely fine craftsmanship. The first strong box contained gold coins, similar to those from Weeping Rock, but in greater quantity. He didn't stop to count them. There would be time for that later. The second box held paper currency, carefully bundled and still surprisingly intact, despite the passage of years. Some of it might even be valuable to collectors, though that was a complication he didn't need. But it was the oilcloth package that commanded his attention. He unwrapped it carefully, revealing multiple items. First, a leather folder containing documents, carefully written pages that appeared to be a detailed account of the Kansas City Federal Reserve train robbery. Names, dates, methods, division of proceeds, everything chronicled in Stone's meticulous handwriting. Second, newspaper clippings about the robbery and its aftermath. Headlines screaming about the bloodshed and massive manhunt. Stories about the murdered law enforcement officers and the engineer who died trying to protect his train. Reading accounts of violence Stone had participated in made the gold feel heavier somehow. And third, most surprisingly, a photograph. Elias held it carefully, a formal portrait of 5 men standing in a photographer's studio. The quality was good, despite age fading. He recognized the faces from the wanted poster: Thomas Reynolds, Jacob Moss, William Garrett, Samuel Diaz, and Ezekiel Stone. They stood shoulder to shoulder, dressed in respectable clothes, unsmiling in the way photographs of that era demanded. They looked like businessmen or ranchers, not outlaws who'd killed for money. Elias studied Samuel Diaz's face, a lean man with hard eyes and a scar running from his temple to his jaw. According to the history book, Diaz had been the gang's most violent member, the one who'd killed the Federal Reserve Guards while others focused on the gold. Stone's journal had mentioned him with a mixture of respect and fear. Was Diaz still alive? If so, he'd be in his 70s now, assuming he'd been similar in age to Stone. Old, but not necessarily harmless. Age didn't remove knowledge or determination, only strength and speed. As Elias examined the documents and photograph, a sound carried across the stillness, the distinct rattle of a horse's bridle. He froze, listening intently. There it was again, closer now. Someone was approaching Devil's Thumb, and they weren't making much effort at stealth. Elias quickly gathered his finds, shoving them into his saddlebag except for the photograph, which he studied one more moment before adding it to the rest. His revolver came to his hand, almost unconsciously. He moved away from the boulder cluster toward better cover, positioning himself where he could see any approach while remaining concealed. A single rider came into view, moving at an easy pace along the dry stream bed Elias had followed earlier. The man sat his horse comfortably, dressed in dark travel clothes and a wide-brimmed hat. He carried himself with the casual alertness of someone accustomed to rough country. As he drew closer, Elias could see he was middle-aged, perhaps 50, with a neatly trimmed beard and wire-rimmed glasses that caught the morning light. He was scanning the landscape methodically, clearly searching for something specific. Marcus Webb. It had to be. The historical researcher who'd asked Garrison about Reynolds' gang gold. Either an enormous coincidence had brought him to Devil's Thumb at the same moment as Elias, or Webb had information that led him here independently. Or, and this thought sent ice through Elias's veins, Webb had been following him, waiting to see where he'd lead. The rider approached the boulder cluster, stopped and dismounted. He studied the area carefully, eventually noticing the shifted third boulder in the exposed cavity. A slight smile crossed his face, as if confirming a theory. He approached the opening cautiously, peering inside with a lamp he'd taken from his saddlebag. Elias watched from concealment, his mind working through options. He could remain hidden and let Webb search the empty cavity, then follow him when he left. He could confront him directly, though that might lead to violence. Or he could leave now, quietly, and hope Webb hadn't noticed Sadie's tracks or other signs of his presence. Before he could decide, Webb's voice carried across the stillness. "Mr. Thorne, isn't it? From Socorro? I imagine you're somewhere nearby, having clearly reached this location first. I mean you no harm. Perhaps we could speak like reasonable men." Elias's grip on his revolver tightened. Webb knew who he was, had likely been tracking him since Socorro, and was confident enough to call him out. This changed everything. Elias stepped from his concealment, revolver held low, but ready. Webb turned smoothly to face him, hands deliberately visible and away from his body. Up close, the man's face showed intelligence and something harder, the look of someone who'd seen enough of life to understand its complexities. "Marcus Webb," the man said calmly. "Though you already knew that, I expect. Henry Garrison's discretion only extends so far when the right questions are asked. You paid him to inform on me. I made a reasonable business arrangement, same as you did." Webb gestured toward the exposed cavity. "Though I see you've been considerably more successful than I have. 4 decades of research, and you beat me to the cache by perhaps half an hour. How long have you been following me?" "Since you left Socorro 3 days ago. You're careful, I'll give you that, but not careful enough for someone carrying significant gold through open country." Webb's expression remained pleasant. "May I lower my hands? Standing like this makes me feel foolish, and I genuinely mean you no harm." Elias considered, then nodded. Webb relaxed slightly but kept his movements slow and visible. I suppose you're wondering what happens now. The thought had crossed my mind. What happens now is we talk. I'm a reasonable man, Mr. Thorne, and you strike me as the same. Neither of us needs to make this difficult. Webb moved to a flat rock and sat, an invitation for Elias to do the same. I've been tracking Reynolds' gang gold for 15 years. It started as academic interest. My doctoral dissertation was on Western outlaws and their economic impact. But the more I researched, the more I realized how much stolen wealth remained unrecovered. So you're a treasure hunter, not a historian. Both, actually. The best treasure hunters always are. Webb smiled slightly. I traced Ezekiel Stone to Redemption Flats 6 years ago. Took me 3 years just to confirm his identity. He covered his tracks remarkably well. By the time I located the church, it had already been sold to you. If you knew about the church, why didn't you buy it yourself? I was in California following another lead when the sale went through. By the time I returned, you'd already found what was hidden and disappeared. I'll admit, that was frustrating. Webb pulled out a tobacco pouch and began rolling a cigarette, his movements casual. But I had Stone's journal entries, the ones he'd written in territorial newspapers under a pseudonym, coded references to his caches, hidden in poetry and editorial pieces. Not the complete record, obviously, but enough to locate Devil's Thumb. Elias felt a chill. If Webb had independent information about Stone's caches, that meant Elias's advantage was smaller than he'd believed. You said you mean me no harm. What do you want? Partnership. You have Stone's personal journal with specific locations. I have research, contacts, and resources to convert gold safely without raising suspicions. Together, we could recover the remaining caches and divide them equitably. Alone, you'll eventually make a mistake that brings law enforcement or worse to your door. Or worse, Samuel Diaz. Webb lit his cigarette, exhaled smoke. You found Stone's letter, I assume, since you're here at Devil's Thumb. You know Diaz might still be alive, might still believe he has a claim to this gold. I've been searching for him too, hoping he'd lead me to caches I couldn't locate independently. 3 months ago, I found evidence he was living in Ciudad Juarez under an assumed name. Was? He left Mexico 6 weeks ago, heading north. I lost his trail near El Paso, but the timing is interesting. Right around when you purchased the Redemption Flats church. Webb's expression grew more serious. I don't believe in coincidences, Mr. Thorne. If Diaz learned that someone was recovering Stone's gold, he'd come looking. And unlike me, his methods wouldn't involve polite conversation. Elias absorbed this information. Another complication layered onto complications. Why should I trust you? Because I'm offering you a choice rather than taking what I want by force. I'm armed. Webb opened his coat slightly, revealing a shoulder holster. But I haven't drawn. Because I understand that you're a desperate man who saw an opportunity for security in his old age. Not a criminal who needs to be brought to justice. We're not so different, you and I. We both want the gold, and we both have reasons for wanting it. What's your reason? 15 years of research, countless expenses, a wife who left me because I was obsessed with dead outlaws and hidden treasure. This gold represents validation and compensation for time I can never recover. Webb finished his cigarette, ground it out carefully. Your reason is simpler: survival and dignity. Both are worth fighting for. The morning sun had climbed higher, bringing heat to the day. Elias considered Webb's proposition from every angle he could see. Partnership meant sharing the gold, but it also meant resources and protection. Refusing meant continuing alone, vulnerable to both Webb's knowledge and Diaz's potential pursuit. How much have you told others about this? Elias asked. No one. My reputation in academic circles is already questionable due to my treasure hunting. Sharing credit or discovery would diminish my position further. Webb stood slowly. I'm proposing a simple arrangement. We pool our resources, recover the remaining caches together, divide everything equally, and go our separate ways. Clean professional, mutually beneficial. Elias lowered his revolver but didn't holster it. I'll need time to consider. Of course. Though I should mention that the longer we stand here at Devil's Thumb, the more visible we become to anyone else who might be watching this area. Webb's eyes held something between warning and urgency. And if Diaz is truly heading north, time is not an abundant resource. The decision hung between them like the heat shimmer rising from desert rock. Elias was about to respond when a sound carried across the landscape, the unmistakable crack of a rifle shot, followed immediately by the whine of a bullet passing between them and striking the boulder face. Both men dropped instinctively, scrambling for cover. Another shot, closer this time, kicking up dust near Webb's position. Elias rolled behind a rock outcropping, his revolver useless at this range. Webb had his own pistol drawn, scanning the landscape for the shooter's position. "North Ridge," Webb called out. 300 yards, maybe more. Single shooter from what I can tell. Elias followed his gaze and caught a glint of sunlight on metal. A rifle barrel, positioned among rocks on the elevated ground overlooking Devil's Thumb. Whoever was shooting had the high ground, clear sight lines and enough distance to make returning fire difficult. Another shot struck near Elias's position, showering him with stone fragments. The shooter knew what he was doing. The shots were precise, meant to pin them down rather than wild attempts at lucky hits. "Diaz," Elias called to Webb. "God, I hope not. He's supposed to be 70-something years old." Age doesn't affect rifle skills much. Another shot, this one striking uncomfortably close to Sadie, who whinnied and pulled at her tether. Elias's heart clenched. If anything happened to that horse because of his greed and foolishness, he'd never forgive himself. Webb fired his pistol toward the ridge, knowing it was futile at this distance, but perhaps hoping to make the shooter reconsider his position. The shots kept coming, methodical and patient. The shooter wasn't trying to kill them immediately. He was keeping them pinned, preventing escape. "We need to move," Webb said urgently. "He's got all day to sit up there while we're exposed down here. Eventually he'll adjust his aim or come closer." "The stream bed," Elias suggested. "It's deep enough for cover if we can reach it. That's 30 yards of open ground." "You have a better idea?" Webb grimaced. "On 3. I'll provide covering fire. It won't help much, but it might make him duck. You run for the stream bed. I'll follow." Before Elias could object, Webb started counting. At 3, he rose and fired rapidly toward the ridge while Elias broke from cover, running in a crouch toward the stream bed. His bad knees protested, his shoulders screamed, but fear and adrenaline overrode pain. Bullets kicked up dirt around him, too close, and then he was sliding into the stream bed, the depression providing blessed cover. Webb followed moments. Later, diving into the ancient watercourse just as another shot struck where he'd been standing. Both men lay breathing hard, pressed against the stream bed's bank. "Well," Webb gasped, "this complicates things." Who else knew about this location? Only Diaz, unless Stone told someone else before he died, or... Webb's expression darkened. "Unless someone followed me the way I followed you." They risked raising their heads to peer over the stream bed's edge. The shooting had stopped, which was somehow more unsettling than when bullets were flying. Either the shooter was repositioning or preparing for something else. Elias studied their situation tactically. The stream bed ran roughly north-south, providing cover if they stayed low and moved carefully. Webb's horse and Sadie were exposed but hadn't been shot. The shooter was focused on the men, not the animals. The strong boxes and documents Elias had recovered were still in his saddlebag. "We can move south along this stream bed," Elias said quietly. "Put distance between us and the shooter, then circle around to the horses once we're out of his sight line. Assuming he doesn't come down from that ridge while we're moving. You have a better plan?" Webb checked his ammunition. "Actually, no. But I want it noted that this treasure hunting business is considerably more exciting than I'd anticipated." They began moving south, staying low, using the stream bed's depth for protection. Behind them, Silence continued. Elias's instincts screamed that something was wrong. An experienced shooter wouldn't just let them escape. They'd covered perhaps 100 yards when they heard it, the sound of rocks sliding, followed by footsteps approaching from the north. The shooter had descended from the ridge and was following them along the stream bed. Elias and Webb exchanged looks. They were being herded, driven away from the horses and supplies toward unknown territory. The stream bed ahead narrowed, the banks growing steeper. In another 100 yards it would become a choke point where they'd be trapped with nowhere to maneuver. "We make a stand here," Elias said, checking his revolver's cylinder. "Better ground than what's ahead." Webb nodded, positioning himself on the opposite bank. "I don't suppose you have any inspirational speeches prepared. Don't get shot. Don't let him get past us to the horses." "Practical. I appreciate that in a partner." The footsteps grew closer, deliberate and unhurried. Whoever was coming knew they were cornered and wasn't rushing. Elias's hands were steady despite his racing heart. Decades of working with unpredictable horses and cattle had taught him to keep fear from affecting his actions. A figure appeared around the stream bed's curve, silhouetted against the bright sky. Tall, lean, moving with the careful grace of someone who'd lived a dangerous life. As he stepped into clearer light, Elias could see his face, weathered and scarred, but unmistakable from the photograph. Samuel Diaz, older but very much alive, carrying a rifle and wearing an expression of cold determination. "Well," Diaz said in a voice rough from decades of hard living, "I was wondering when someone would finally come for Ezekiel's gold." Samuel Diaz kept his rifle trained on them, but made no move to shoot. His face, weathered by 7 decades of hard living, showed neither anger nor particular emotion, just the flat assessment of someone calculating odds and outcomes. "You can lower those pistols," Diaz said. "If I wanted you dead, you'd already be dead. I hit what I aim at, always have." Neither Elias nor Webb holstered their weapons. After a moment, Diaz shrugged and lowered his rifle, though he kept it ready. "Fair enough. Man reaches our age. Trust doesn't come easy." He studied them carefully. "You'd be Thorne, the one who bought Ezekiel's church, and you're the researcher who's been asking questions across 3 states. Webb, isn't it?" "You've been watching us," Webb said. "I've been watching for anyone who might lead me to Ezekiel's caches. Didn't expect 2 of you, but that's how things go sometimes." Diaz's scarred face creased in something that might have been a smile. 40 years I've been wondering if I'd ever see that gold again. Ezekiel and I made an agreement back in '86. We'd split up, lay low, and never touch the caches unless both agreed. I kept my word. Then 6 months ago, I hear someone bought that church in Redemption Flats. Figured Ezekiel was finally making a move, or maybe he died and left instructions. "He's dead," Elias said. "Died in 1898 by his own hand." Something crossed Diaz's face. Genuine sadness, brief but real. I'd wondered. Ezekiel never was comfortable with what we'd done. That last job in Kansas City broke something in him. He gestured with the rifle toward the boulder cluster. "So you found Devil's Thumb. What else?" "The church, Weeping Rock." Elias saw no point in lying. Diaz could kill them and search their belongings regardless. "That's 3 out of 5 then. The Canyon del Muerto cache is on Apache land, probably untouchable. The Spanish mission location," Diaz paused. "That one's complicated. It has to do with the Kansas City job." Webb spoke carefully. "We found records in the Devil's Thumb cache, documents about that robbery. Then you know it went wrong. We'd planned it careful, but the Federal Reserve Guards fought back hard. Thomas Reynolds got trigger happy, and by the time the shooting stopped, 4 men were dead. We got the gold, but we lost something else that day." Diaz's expression hardened. "We lost any pretense that we were just outlaws taking from rich institutions. We were killers, plain and simple. Ezekiel couldn't live with that. Neither could I, truth be told. But I'm still here regardless." The sun climbed higher, heat building in the stream bed. Elias found himself studying Diaz with something approaching understanding. This wasn't a monster, but a man who'd made terrible choices and spent 40 years living with the consequences. "So what happens now?" Elias asked. Diaz was quiet for a long moment. "I came north, planning to take what was mine by right. 40 years is a long time to wait for what you're owed. But standing here looking at you two, I'm thinking about something Ezekiel once told me. He said the gold was cursed, that everyone who touched it paid a price. He paid his by living a lie until it killed him. I paid mine by spending 40 years in exile." He lowered his rifle completely. "I'm 74 years old. Got emphysema from working in mines down in Mexico. Doctor says I've got maybe 2 years if I'm lucky. What would I do with that gold now? Buy medicine to squeeze out a few more months? Live in comfort while remembering the men I killed to earn it?" Webb and Elias exchanged glances. Neither had expected this turn. "You can keep what you've found," Diaz continued. "All of it. My share, Ezekiel's share, all of it. Consider it payment for solving a mystery I'd given up on. But I want something in return." "What?" Elias asked. "The documents from Devil's Thumb, the complete record of Kansas City. I want you to give them to the authorities. Proper authorities who'll make sure the families of those dead men know the truth about what happened. Names, details, everything. They deserve to know their people didn't die for nothing, that justice came eventually even if it took 40 years. It was the last thing Elias had expected. "You'd expose yourself." "I'm dying anyway. Mexico's extradition treaties are complicated enough that they probably couldn't get me back to the States for trial, even if they wanted to. And honestly," Diaz's voice grew quieter, "I'm tired of carrying it. 40 years of guilt is heavy enough without dragging it to the grave." The three men stood in the stream bed, decades and circumstances separating them but also somehow binding them together. Elias thought about his father's watch, about the choices that had brought him from honest ranch work to claiming outlaw gold, about redemption and whether it was possible for anyone. "I'll do it," Elias said. "I'll make sure the right people get those documents." Diaz nodded slowly. "Then we're settled." He turned to leave, then paused. "One more thing. The Spanish mission cache. It's not worth going after. Nothing there but paper money that's probably disintegrated by now and more records of our crimes. Sometimes the past is better left buried." He walked away up the stream bed, rifle slung over his shoulder, an old man disappearing into the harsh landscape. Neither Elias nor Webb moved to stop him. "Well," Webb said eventually. "That was unexpected." "Yeah." They retrieved their horses, gathered the strong boxes and documents, and made camp away from Devil's Thumb. That evening, as the sun set in spectacular colors across the western sky, they divided the gold into equal shares. Webb would take his portion and disappear back into academic circles, his obsession finally satisfied. Elias would convert his share carefully, buy the land he'd always dreamed of, and live whatever years remained to him in peace. But first, he'd keep his promise to Diaz. The documents would go to federal authorities along with a letter explaining their discovery. The families of those killed in Kansas City would finally have answers, even if those answers came 40 years too late. 3 weeks later, Elias stood on property he'd purchased in the hill country north of Socorro, 200 acres of good grazing land with water rights and a small but solid house. Sadie grazed contentedly nearby. His father's pocket watch ticked steadily in his vest pocket, marking time that finally felt like it was moving in the right direction. He'd done questionable things to get here. He'd claimed stolen gold, pursued outlaw treasure, made choices his father might not have been proud of. But he'd also kept his word to a dying man, ensured that forgotten victims received some measure of closure, and learned something about the complicated nature of redemption. Sometimes transformation wasn't about becoming someone entirely different. Sometimes it was just about making the next right choice, then the one after that, building a better future, one decision at a time. The sun set over his land, painting everything in gold. Elias smiled slightly, pulled out his father's watch, and checked the time. 5:30. Time to make dinner, tend to Sadie, and settle into his new life. Time to stop running from his past and start building toward his future. The gold was spent, the secrets were shared, and the curse, if there ever had been one, was finally broken. What remained was just a man, his horse, his land, and whatever time he had left to make something good from what he'd been given. It was enough. More than enough. It was everything.